Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to paint something completely different. I'm just going to be playing around with two colours, Prussian blue and burnt sienna, and I'm just going to be experimenting and trying to paint a sort of semi-abstract undersea scene like coral reefs and seaweed. I'm on lockdown at the moment in England, so I've got plenty of time to experiment. And today I'm using the back of an old painting, and it's Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper or knot paper, and it's £140 weight. I've just simply got it taped to my board, and I'm using a large harky brush to soak the paper. My board is tilted at about 45 to 60 degrees, so when I paint wet in wet, then the paint should run down nicely. Now this is my large bamboo Chinese harky brush. It's just a cheap brush that I found on eBay, but I find it really useful for experimenting like this because it covers the paper really quickly. Now I'm using Prussian blue here, and I want a sort of all over coverage, but not even, because I want to try and get the sort of semi-abstract glowing light of the sort of underwater look, if you know what I mean. Now this is burnt sienna, the only other colour I'm going to use, and I'm applying this very thick with just a cheap old wash brush. As you can see, the paint's just running down, and that's fine. I can turn the board around however I like, just to help the paint to run. I can add more water. I can move the paint around with the brush. There we are. I'm just flicking some water on it, and you can see the two colours are mingling and running together. And because this is just a semi-abstract experiment, I'm just letting the paint do exactly what it wants to do, looking at the effects and moving the paint around and letting it flow and do what watercolour paint and water does, which is just to flow on the page until I feel it looks somewhere close to where I want it to be. Now I'm going to put some extra dark Prussian blue across the bottom, just to sort of suggest the seabed. I'm trying to keep it darker at the bottom and lighter at the top, so that, as I say, the bottom suggests the seabed and the top suggests the sort of dappled sunlight that's coming through from above the surface of the water. Starting to look quite interesting. I like the way it's diffusing across the top. So now I'm going to sprinkle some ordinary table salt across the lower area, not completely covering it, but sort of mostly across the sort of middle area. And I'm hoping that the salt will create some effects that will look a little bit like coral. Salt can be quite unpredictable, so I'm just keeping my fingers crossed, and I'll have to see how it dries. Now I'm just to add a little bit more texture and interest into the wet wash, because it's still all wet. I'm using a bristle brush, and I have flicked some water on it just to see if I can get some little blooms and runbacks. And now I'm flicking with this bristle brush some burnt sienna, just to add some more of this lovely orange colour to the wet wash, and it should just disperse quite nicely. In some areas it'll stay quite dark. I'm just adding a little bit more salt across the middle as well. I want lots and lots of lovely texture here, and I think I'm going to flick just a bit more clean water into it, again just to try and create these little blooms and deliberate runbacks and marks where the water will push the paint aside and create these lovely patterns. I'm just going to pull a bit more of that thick Prussian blue across the bottom to darken it all up. Now I'm just going to leave it to dry and see how it looks. Well, it's completely dried. It's dried lighter, but it looks lovely. I've brushed all the salt off, and now I'm deciding what to do. I love this area here. I'm not going to do much to that, but this other main area I'm going to add some seaweed. But if we look close, you can see the effect of the salt and see what I mean about the salt creating the look of sort of like coral reef effects. Now this is my pin liner, or it's like a bit like a sort of a sword liner or a dagger brush. I don't know the make of it. It was a present from my daughter, but I'm going to use this with the two colours, Prussian blue first, and then I'm going to go in with the burnt sienna, and I'm going to use this lovely long bristled brush or haired brush, I think it's squirrel, to start building up what looks like long strands of seaweed just being wafted around by the underwater currents. This pin liner brush is really useful because it holds an awful lot of water and paint, so you can create some lovely long flowing lines with it without having to keep dipping it into the paint. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of water spatter. Now what that will do is that will soften some of my lines as I paint through the slightly damp patches. Then the lines will soften out a little bit more. As I say, I want these to look like strands of seaweed being gently moved around by the current across the coral reef. It takes a little while to do this. It's a little bit like using a rigger for trees. It's the same sort of process that I go through when I'm painting lots of branches, just trying to get enough of a tangle of lighter and darker marks, thinner and thicker ones. All my marks I want to sort of tend from the bottom right corner, but sort of heading towards the top. I'm going in with slightly thicker burnt sienna now, just building up the layers of seaweed. If you don't have one of these pin liner brushes, you can use any brush that you're comfortable with. A rigger is quite useful for this, or maybe a Chinese calligraphy brush, because they hold quite a lot of paint and water, so you can get nice expressive brush strokes. Be a bit more careful as I pull those strokes across this light corner towards the top left. I want to preserve as much of that clear as possible, but I want to have some of the strands of seaweed coming across that area. Bit more Prussian blue, and I've nearly finished this kind of tangle of seaweed. The last thing that I'm going to do is use a very thick, rich mix of the Prussian blue to bring a slightly different type of seaweed across the whole picture, just to sort of focus things in a little bit more. Now I'm going to mix up very rich mixture of the Prussian blue for this, and I'm going to be a bit more careful and make my marks a little bit less random, try and sort of undulate these marks, and I'm going from one side right across to the other. I want these to be like ribbons of seaweed. Now I'm going to take the corner of a plastic store card. I'm just going to run it through the wet paint in places, just to add a slightly different look and texture as I etch some paler marks through the wet paint. Just think another couple of these ribbon-like strands in really thick Prussian blue, just to finish this off a bit. See how lovely this brush is to use. Well, I think that's it. I think that's just about finished now. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching me experiment here with this semi-abstract underwater scene, and I hope you'll have a go at something similar yourselves, because experimenting like this can be so much fun, and you can discover things and effects that you didn't know you could make or create, and it can inspire you to do all sorts of different things and to create all sorts of different scenes and landscapes. You could add fish to this. You could use similar effects in a different sort of landscape, maybe for some loose abstract flowers or a field or something like that. The possibilities when you're experimenting are endless. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you so much for all your support, which is very much appreciated. Take care, stay safe, I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.